Hello, everyone. Welcome today to an interview of a druid who is going to tell us everything you want to know about druids and especially also about paganism. What is paganism? Where does the word comes from? And everything about it. So I ask you to welcome Luke Eastwood. Luke, how are you?
Hi, thank you very much for having me. I'm fine, thank you. How are you doing?
Very good. Very glad to have you back. So, Luke, you are a trained horticulturist who studied in a Dublin School of Horticulture. You have also worked in the horticulture industry. You're very skilled in that, but you're also a druid. You have completed your training a long time ago with OBOD, the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids. And you've been involved in various groves and spiritual organizations for around 20 years. Also, you founded the Irish Druid Network, and you write for various magazines and websites on spiritual, green, social, and political issues. You're doing a lot of things. Luke, welcome. And so, what is exactly this word, paganism? Pagan. Where does it come from? What is it exactly?
Okay, well, the word itself comes from a Roman word, a Latin word, paganus, which is supposed to be basically a sort of a rustic person. There's various interpretations of what it actually means, but generally it's regarded as sort of like a country dweller, an ignorant, sort of uneducated, unskilled person. It's sort of a derogatory term, really, originally, as sort of someone outside of the remit of Rome, and who lived in the middle of nowhere and perhaps a bit stupid or a bit backward. So it became used as a derogatory term, really. I suppose even today it might be used in a derogatory way by certain people. Much like the word heathen would be used as well, in a rather derogatory sense. But it's quite interesting, really, because if you think back to the era before Christianity, most people would be defined as pagans, really, by today's terms. Before Christianity, you had quite a lot of different religions. I think at the moment there's several thousand different religions still existing in the world, but there used to be an awful lot more than there are now. A lot of them have been wiped out, and many of them have actually been wiped out by Christianity and Islam in particular. Those two religions have wiped out hundreds, maybe thousands of different religions that used to exist. So if you look at it in that context, Christianity and Islam have portrayed paganism as sort of evil and tantamount to Satanism or devil worship, as something rather very negative, quite evil. And the work of the devil, such terms like that would be used. But some of these religions have been around for a very long time. Even at the infancy of Christianity, some of these religions were already very old. Sort of the kind of polytheism you'd see in Sumeria, that would have been like 4,000 years old already when Jesus came along. And then Egyptian religion, again, very old, going back 4,000 years prior to the arrival of Jesus. Zoroastrianism, that's super old. You still find that today in Iran, a small amount, and particularly in India. Hindu religion, I mean, even Buddhism, some would class that as paganism, although in the kind of classical definition, modern definition of what pagan is, You wouldn't really include Buddhism in that. But that's 500 years older than Christianity. So you've got this sort of watershed moment when, I suppose, really around the time of Constantine, about 325 or so, when the Roman Empire took on Christianity as their official religion, that they started to demonize all the older religions. And that's also applied to Judaism, which isn't obviously defined as pagan, but the Jewish people never really accepted the Roman Empire. There had been various uprisings there. I think the most famous one was about 66 AD, which ended in disaster. But so the Romans weren't very keen on promoting Judaism either, and they certainly wanted to eliminate the paganism that was around in Rome. I mean, the Roman paganism was very similar to what the Greeks believed. They had basically the same pantheon, very, very similar. And so you've got this process all across the empire where they tried to stamp out the indigenous religions and replace it with Christianity. You see that in North Africa, in Egypt, and all across that region, across to Carthage. They just tried to obliterate it, and it was replaced with Christianity. A lot of the damage done to Egyptian temples and such like that's actually generally believed to have been done by the Muslims was actually done a lot earlier by the Christians, who defaced hieroglyphs and destroyed statues, etc., etc. I mean, after the Islamic invasion of Egypt, they did more again, but it had already been done significantly at that point. And then you look at Europe. I mean, there were lots of religions in Europe that were just wiped out completely by the Roman Church, forced conversions. And, people that were formerly pagan are convinced that their old religion was evil, that it was the work of the devil. You can even see that in the New World, where the new religion was brought to South America and North America, and they were told that their indigenous beliefs were evil, and to abandon it and become Christians. And I mean, that kind of thing has still been going on, sort of into the last century. And I have nothing wrong with people being Christian if they want to be. That's fine. I really think people should be free to believe what they want. But this idea of evangelism, that you have to be on a holy mission to convert everybody else to your religion, that's just so wrong. I really can't agree with that. I mean, even now you've got people in the really kind of hardcore Christian communities who just think everyone who's not Christian is doomed, that they're going to hell, and that it's their duty to try and save everybody from the devil and going to hell because they don't believe in Jesus. Okay, that's their belief, fair enough, but it really doesn't make any sense to me, because basically on that point of view, everybody that was born before the coming of Jesus, they're all doomed. They didn't believe in Jesus before he existed. So what about them? What happens to them? Do they all go to hell, or are they in limbo, or whatever? It doesn't actually make sense.
Yeah. So paganism, in a way.
I'm losing you there. I can't hear you.
Oh, paganism would be, in a way, not believing in the official religion. It would be everything else that is not the official religion validated by the governments. Would it be the term we could explain it?
Well, kind of. I mean, each religion would have its own beliefs. So, You know, if you believed in, say, for instance, the Egyptian paganism, it doesn't mean that you also believe in, say, Taoism in China. But you would probably accept that there are many different paths, and you know, each society will have its own one, each set of people, and even within the same area, people had different religions. You know, some people followed in Rome; they followed the official pantheon of like Jupiter, etc. And you know, there would be people that followed Mithra, and there would also be the people who believed in, you know, the cult of Isis, and Osiris was very popular back then. So before it became Christianized, you had a multitude of different faiths, and they coexisted, most of them fairly peacefully. You know, you've had a similar situation in many countries, where you've got different sects, different religions, that coexisted without violence, without oppression. And it's just unfortunate, really, that you've got these two relatively new religions, one from, well, just over 2,000 years ago, and one from, well, it's about, 1,400 years ago. That's Christianity and Islam. And they unfortunately, they both have a tendency to be very oppressive. And you've got this very hierarchical, rigid structure. Of course, it's all been written down, and people have taken to interpreting this in a very, I suppose, in a way that's quite manipulative, I suppose. Whereas a lot of other religions maybe don't even have a text; they might not have a book. So I suppose that's a big difference. I think a lot of there's bad people in every religion, obviously, but I'd say a lot of people who are in these alternative or pagan faiths are probably a bit more open-minded. They're not as dogmatic, and perhaps more willing to accept other people's right to have the beliefs that they want to have.
Thank you. The main reason of this this video was to me to explain people that it is not white and dark regarding to religions, and Christian religions, for instance, and non-Christians, like such as pagans. There is a lot of misunderstanding nowadays due to misinformation and just simply ignorance, to induce people to think that what is not religious, what doesn't follow the religion of a book, whatever, you know, it can be Christian, Muslim, Jewish, is evil. So that's a misunderstanding, and that's why I'm enjoying listening to you explaining to us that all these other ancient traditions are in fact beautiful earth-based spiritualities, honoring gods and entities of the earth and the universe. So what would you tell to clarify a little bit to everybody who is a bit confused by everything we are being fed with? What would you say to help?
I would say you're right. There's a lot of beautiful traditions, but you've got to also remember it's not all wonderful. I mean, a lot of these ancient religions did have violent side to them as well. You had the good and bad together. As you say, it's not all black and white. There's a lot of grey areas actually in older religions too. You've got some very positive gods and goddesses, but you also have some very negative ones too. A great example of this would be Kali in the Hindu tradition. The devotees of Kali, a certain sect, are called Thuggis, from which you get the modern word thug. And what they used to like to do was murder people. One part of their cult, they used to take like a sock or a stocking, fill it with coins, and batter people over the head with them, and kill them, and rob them. And that was quite a bloodthirsty cult in India, all devoted to Kali. You has some positive aspects, but was also a goddess of death and destruction. And you'll see similar kind of characters in other religions too. Like in the Norse religion, Loki is a sort of trickster god who's not very nice, and Morrigan in the Celtic Irish tradition can be very wise and helpful, but also very vengeful too, quite sadistic even. So it's not as clear cut as just good and bad. I mean, if anyone that's read the Greek myths knows that, you know, the gods could be quite capricious, quite cruel, and almost toy with mankind, and certainly could be not above punishing people for their indiscretions. So you've got sort of a left and a right hand, you know, the sort of the uplifting, kind, intellectual, inspiring, loving. But on the other hand, you've also got destruction and vengefulness. And the two, I suppose, go hand in hand, reflecting the real realities of life. So in a way, I'd say a lot of these religions are more realistic. It's not all geared towards some imaginary holy person that's sitting up in the sky, you know, like this picture of God or whatever. And then there's a devil in this reality that's sort of, you know, in hell. That there are obviously forces of positivity and negativity, or good and evil, that run through the world, through the whole universe, I'd say. But there's a balance that exists with these things. Yeah. That the one doesn't exist without the other. You can't have light and no night, no day. If you had constant darkness, there wouldn't be any kind of manifest universe. It would just be a void of blackness. There'd be no form, no existence. And the same, if you had just blinding light, the same, there'd be nothing. It would just be another void, but from the other end, the other opposite end of the spectrum. So I think a lot of these older religions do more accurately reflect the dynamic of the universe and of the human condition and of just life and creation in general.
Yes, and I suppose as well human psyche as well.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that's very much apparent is free will, you know. I mean, that carries forth into Christianity too, but, you know, we have a choice. We can bring out the best in ourselves, the worst in ourselves. And ultimately, we have a choice about how we're going to live our lives. And a lot of this wisdom in these other religions has been lost. Of course, some of it is carried forward, certainly in esoteric forms of Christianity and Islam, like Rosicrucianism, or in Islam, the Sufi tradition. Some of these older ideas are carried forward. But, you know, they're kind of minority sects within these kind of religions. And a lot of this early ideas have been obliterated, unfortunately, in the sort of mainstream modern world of religion.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, it's very helpful to raise a bit more of this confusion, to clear a little bit the confusion. What would you say are coexisting nowadays as different pagan movements, such as witchcraft, druidry? Could you name the main movements that we could sort out who is who a little bit, please?
Okay, well, I would say with the decline of the Catholic Church in particular, you've got a big rise in Buddhism, which some people wouldn't class at all as pagan. Other people would. I mean, they've got their own religious texts. The Dharmapada, written by the Buddha about 500 BC. So that'll be one that's become really more and more popular in the last 50 years or so. But then the more of them, what people classically refer to as paganism, would be sort of what they call the Western mystery tradition in general, as sort of more of a European thing more than anything. And you've got two main kind of groups. You've got sort of Druidism or Druidry, which is what I'm particularly interested in. And then you've got various types of witchcraft and their offshoots. The most popular one of those is a modern form of witchcraft called Wicca. I mean, it's a very loaded term, the term witchcraft. I mean, people associate that with, to a large extent, with evil, to do with, witch trials, etc., and all that. So it's very loaded. A lot of people's image of the witch, maybe to some extent, something that doesn't deserve the label as God, but you'd also have to remember that there's more than one type of person that will call themselves a witch. Broadly, people call themselves a white or black, and you've got people who are sort of what you call ambivalent, where they'd be for hire, like offering their magical or spiritual services, and that all depends on the person. Somebody might agree to put a love spell on someone, and without sort of consulting, that person's free will, whether the person that's going to be put under the spell, what about their free will? Do they have a right to decide for themselves, or they're just subjected to this kind of thing, to some kind of a charm or a glamour or whatever it might be called? And then you've got more sinister stuff like cursing. Somebody might ask someone to put a curse on somebody, and they pay them to do it. And you've cases of that all across the world in culture. So it's a very loaded term. I mean, there are people who call themselves witches who would never do anything like that, who are entirely devoted to the service of good and to trying to help humanity, help the world. But then you've other people as well who don't think like that. I mean, one thing that's you've got people who are traditional witches, which is inherited, sort of passed down through a line or trained by people who've in that tradition. And then you've got this much more modern Wiccan movement, which is massive now across the world. But that only started in like 1948 or something. So it's actually very, very young. But it's, obviously based on older forms. And then you've got sort of shamanism, which kind of falls between many stools. It's kind of a strange term because it kind of referred originally to people from the sort of Russia, Mongolian sort of area, even suppose into Finland, the Sami people. They're sort of stretching across Northern Europe, across the whole of Russia, and down into Mongolia as well. So, but that's kind of taken on a much broader term now in the modern world, with that embracing similar things in North America, South America, different parts of Europe, in parts of Asia. So, and also even, you've got a kind of crossover between shamanism and Druidism as well.
Yeah.
So, again, some people would define this as the work of a devil, as evil, that's all terrible. But then, the Catholic Church is saying that Reiki is evil and the work of the devil. I mean, that comes from a Buddhist tradition from Japan. The guy who developed it, Dr. Usui, was actually a Buddhist monk and not an evil person or a servant of the devil. And they've also said that yoga is evil. Yoga
I know.
is a very ancient form of spiritual and physical exercise, which comes from the Vedic culture of India. So rooted in Hinduism, probably maybe have been around even before that. It's thousands of years old. Yoga is older than Christianity. And, again, you've got these Catholic priests saying, if you go to yoga class, you're evil. You're a son of the devil. Your soul's in danger, and you're a servant of Satan. I mean, it is so utterly preposterous and ridiculous.
I know. It's obviously to stop people to find ways to reconnect to their own sovereignty and power, and keep on being maintained in ignorance and slavery, mental slavery to the church. Obviously,
yeah, absolutely. They just can't accept that there's a sort of a multipolar world where there are many different paths to choose. And one thing they're very against is what I call Gnosticism, which is, like you say, about sovereignty. Within Christianity, there is a sort of a Gnostic path, which is very much about your own connection to God or to Jesus, which kind of does away with the need for a priest, So if you're a Gnostic person, you create your own connection with God or spirit or divinity, whatever you want to call it. So why, that puts them out of a job. So that's why they don't like it, because, if everybody sat in the church goes, actually, I'm going to go home and I'm going to pray to God and make my own connection and do my own ritual and my own thing.
They're out of job. No more Vatican.
Yeah, no more money to send back to Rome, to the Pope, and, to the Archbishop or whatever. No more money to fund the roof repairs and whatever. So it's a lot of it.
Else.
Yeah, it's about control of the masses and about keeping the money pouring in as well.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. I was planning to take questions after a little while, but there are many interesting questions, and before it just scrolls away and I forget about it, I'm going to take a few questions that I just spotted. So this one, this person called asks, doesn't the word pagan just mean of the country as opposed to the sophisticated folks in the cities? So
that's one translation of what it actually means. But it's one of those things. This is a term that goes back a long way in time. Like what it meant in 1700 odd years ago might be slightly different now. So I mean, words change over time. So that as with many words, there may have been more than one interpretation. But I could just imagine it being used as a bit of an insult. God, look at those pagans. They still believe in those daft gods. Aren't they backwards and stupid, kind of thing? Because, a bit like maybe somebody that's sort of, I don't know, driving a really crappy old tractor that's falling to pieces down to the shops, and everyone else has got shiny new electric cars or something. People would probably make a lot of derogatory remarks about that person on the old tractor. So I can imagine people saw it in that way to a large extent, as sort of being a bit backwards. So, but that's definitely one of the interpretations. They're dead right in that.
Thank you very much. There's a question here. Oh, where it goes up. Richard, I suppose. You ask, does paganism work off the principle of karma?
I would say, generally speaking, yes. But I mean, there's so many different forms of paganism. Certainly, you'd find that in both Hinduism and in Buddhism, which sort of inherited that from Hinduism. And the term itself, karma, does actually come from the Hindu religion. And then was passed into Buddhism because Siddhartha, the first Buddha, was a Hindu before he founded his own religion. But you'll find very, very similar concepts to that in other forms of paganism. You would have something similar to that in Wicca, this idea of this threefold return. If you do a bad deed to somebody, it'll come back to you three times as worse. And you'd have something similar in sort of the Celtic religion as well. So the concept of, you know, what you receive in your life is based on what you've done. Yeah, that, I mean, that even goes way back into the Egyptian religion, when people at the afterlife went to be judged, and your heart was put on the scales, and if it was heavier than the feather, then you could be blown into oblivion, and you wouldn't go into the afterlife. So, you know, the concept of paying for your misdeeds is really ancient.
Yeah. So you mentioned Wicca. I saw passing a lot of questions at the start of the interview about Wicca. People are confused. I saw many same question repeating from different people. Is Wicca good or bad? And, you know, it's a lot of fear around Wicca. So maybe it's nice to just clear this a little bit, please.
Okay, well, I would say that depends. There's no real short answer. To say yes, it's good is actually just to I suppose misleading, really. But then to say it's bad is also wrong. I'd say it's a bit more ambivalent than that. It's sort of, I suppose, the modern form of witchcraft is sort of moving towards trying to be positive, trying to be good. But, you know, there's a lot of room, a lot of wiggle room in that. So I suppose it really depends on the person, on the practitioner. They're organized in what's called covens, and it's sort of hierarchical in a way. Sort of, you have a leader, and then people are trained, and then they can leave and start their own coven. So it all goes back to the origins, which start with Gerald Gardner, and then another type under this guy called Alexander's. So you've two main branches, and it's now gone off into many offshoots. But I would say, you know, if you get involved in it, a lot depends on your own self, whether you're a good person or not, and also the training that you receive, and sort of the ethics of the coven leader or leaders. Sometimes you have two. Quite often you do, actually. I mean, if those people have good ethics and the way they train you is good, then probably you're going to lean towards ethical and good behavior. I mean, if you have someone less ethical who's more ambivalent, or even, you know, quite a bad person, it's obviously going to rub off on all the people who are trained within that coven. So I suppose it depends. You know, it doesn't have the kind of very strict codes that could be applied to Christianity and to Islam, to Judaism, and to Buddhism as well. There isn't like some official rule book. Like there's no sort of 10 commandments in Wicca. Yeah, the answer is it depends, really. I can't give you anything more specific than that. I suppose the same also applies with Druidism. I mean, if you look in the history of Druidry, there's been some really evil Druids in the mythology. You know, Druids that have killed people, that have put curses on people. And then you've also Druids who've used their skills for good. So
it's everywhere. It's like Christian priests. It's the same. The good priest, bad priest. It depends on who you are at the start yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, there is a branch within, I suppose, witchcraft, which you could say is is evil, and that would be obviously Satanism. Now that's not a mainstream thing, and it's a subject a lot of people run from. They're terrified to talk about it, and even in the pagan community, a lot of people are terrified to talk about it because they think, well, if I mention that, it's going to make people think that shamans and Wiccans and Druids are something to do with that. What has happened is the church has characterized these forms of paganism as if they were Satanism, but it's completely and utterly different. For starters, most pagans wouldn't actually say they believe in Satan. They don't believe in a character such as the devil. So if that's the case, if you don't believe in the devil, then how could you actually be a Satanist? That wouldn't be possible, really. So those accusations are a bit false, but there is such a thing as Satanism in this world. There are people who are involved in magic and necromancy, dark witchcraft, who are servants of Satan. That's what they're devoted to. They, and some of them would try to portray themselves as harmless and benign, like you've got the Church of Satan in America and sort of Satanists in these Luciferians, and they say, oh, it's not real, we don't really believe in a little Satan and all this, but that's just a load of old hogwash, really. It's just a way of sort of covering up for the actual horrible core of their beliefs, which is quite vile, really. Self-determination and all that, and freedom of choice is fair enough, but then when you use it to harm other people, then I draw the line there. But in some countries you've got absolute freedom of religion. For instance, I think in America, as part of the Constitution, if I'm right, you can follow any religion you like. If you wanted to worship fluffy bunnies and have a big purple bunny as your
God.
deity, your god, you could have that. And by that same token, if you want to be a Satanist, then you're allowed to be. It's actually not illegal to be a Satanist, as far as I know. I have to double check that, but I think that's my understanding of it. So if you are one of these people, you're not breaking any laws by doing that. But what you might actually be doing as part of your practice, that might be illegal.
Yeah, if you kill children, then you break a law.
Exactly.
To clear another confusion, because we're not shy on my channel, so we can let's talk a bit more about Satanism, because there's a lot of fear and questions around it at the moment, because it just comes out of these things. Is Satanism a movement on its own, or it is attached to other movements such as witchcraft or Wiccan or whatever else, or is it separate from these movements, something on its own?
It's both, actually, because you have people who are members of a satanic religion or a satanic organization. I mentioned the Church of Satan. There's the Temple of Set. There's various other ones as well. A particularly evil one, which I would suggest you avoid at all costs, would be the Order of Nine Angles. Now, they're probably the worst and most fundamentally evil organization that exists that I've come across. They would be, far more extreme, and they wouldn't have this kind of sort of user-friendly appearance. In fact, they're not very well known. They don't publicize themselves like some of the kind of more mainstream sort of Satanist organizations, trying to be all like populist and mainstream and, hey, we're great, we're really nice people, really, don't be scared of us kind of stuff. They wouldn't be like that. So you've got all these different grades of organizations which are sort of within the kind of remit of Satanism. And then, of course, you've a lot of people who I suppose the only word for them is infiltrators. They're within every religion, within every pagan religion, and within the church, within Islam, within Buddhism, within every religion, you have got satanic infiltrators who are actually Satanists, but they're not going to advertise the fact. The purpose of them being there is to observe what's going on, and also to try to undermine everything. You know, they're not going to go around with a badge on saying, "Hey, I'm a Satanist." You know, they're covert. They're under the radar. They're, you know, they know full well they're going to be far more effective at sowing chaos and disorder if no one knows that they're there. So, you know, they're very hard to detect. But believe me, they are in every single religion across the world. Yeah. I mean, people don't like to admit it. And, you know, you'll often be called a freak or, you know, a lunatic, conspiracy theorist if you openly say this. But unfortunately, that is the case, you know. I mean, there are instances littered throughout recent history and going back hundreds of years of people who've been found guilty of satanic crimes. And yeah, it's often not very well publicized, but if you do a bit of research, you know, the fact that these crimes have occurred and these people have been caught and prosecuted and punished for these things is proof that it exists.
Yeah, absolutely. Would you agree with Richard, who says black magic is in Satanism?
Yes. Well, black magic doesn't necessarily involve Satanism, but Satanism by definition is a form of black magic. Absolutely. I mean, basically, black magic is using what you'd call the left-hand path. In various different forms of religion and magic, you have sort of the light and the dark, the left and the right. The left is generally associated with negativity and darkness and black. I'm actually left-handed, so that's not great for me, is it? The right-hand side is associated with the positive forces, with light, you know, and the color white. These are just sort of generalizations. It's just a convenient way of labeling things.
Yeah.
But yeah, the middle path is sort of between the two. This middle path, which many kind of magicians follow, is neither on the left or the right. It's sort of straight down the middle. So definitely, if you're following sort of the area of necromancy or dark magic, black magic, and using these forces, summoning negative forces, working with demons, etc., then yeah, you could call that black magic, and that is something that, you know, people who are Satanists would work exclusively with that end of things, you know.
So could you just in few words make the difference between black magic and white magic in general?
Okay, I mean, I don't really like that term as such because it's very, very reductive.
I know.
But I would say in general, you know, someone who's on the you know, the left-hand path, the black magic, dark magic side, would think nothing of revenge or punishing people, of aggression, of, you know, perhaps even killing someone in the most extreme cases, and certainly not, you know, things like vengeance, doing curses and such things. They'd be okay with that, you know. Whereas someone who's on the you know, the the right-hand path, or what you might refer to as white magic, would try to rise above the most base and sort of negative instincts within humanity. I mean, everybody, is prone to certain things, as like anger. Like, say, for instance, someone comes up and punches you in the face. You're going to be very angry. But I suppose the big difference between the two, it would be how you react to being punched in the face. You might
That's it.
you might decide to rise above it. You might try to negotiate with that person. You might try to understand what they did. You might try to find some way of getting past it without resorting to violence yourself. And it's not to say that there aren't times when it would be appropriate, to defend yourself. Someone's trying to punch you in the face. It's perfectly appropriate. You kind of defend yourself. You stop them from doing it again. But whether you'd vindictively punish them for that or try to kill them or whatever, if you're a person that is on the right-hand path, you would not. You'd try to rise above those instincts and try to handle it in a higher way. You'd probably call to sort of like some kind of higher magic in yourself and to higher powers like God or gods or deity, whatever you want to call it, on a higher level, to just raise your energy above that, not to stoop down into the gutter and lie down in the filth with the person that's behaved in that way. So there are two very different approaches to dealing with a situation. So I mean, ultimately, it comes down to in your internal kind of sense of morality on how you think difficult situations should be dealt with. And it's interesting, really. It's when you're challenged, when you have a difficult situation in life, that's when you really find out whether you're on the left or the right-hand path,
Yeah, very interesting. It depends not of the tradition or the belief, but of the person. It depends on who you are as in your life. Yeah, that's very interesting. Well, I think it helps a lot to understand that paganism is not something very dark like we are hearing, and there is bad intention and good intention in any religion, in any tradition, and as you explain it so well, it depends on the practitioner, the heart of the person who practices, not about the dogma or the tradition by itself. It's what you do with it. The religion and the tradition is the tool, I suppose. Would you agree?
Yes, absolutely. And also your teachers. Good teachers is very important. You might have good intentions and be a kind and honorable person, but if your teachers are particularly bad, you may pick up some bad practices, bad habits that aren't going to benefit you or be of service to the world. I think one of the things that's very much part of, I suppose, the light side of things is trying to be of service, to do something good with your life, with your intentions, with your abilities, and not to be self-serving and selfish all the time, which is very much one of the things you find with the more negative religions. It's self-serving. They don't really care about other people or the world. It's more about self-empowerment and sod everybody else,
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let us rise a bit the vibration of this conversation, because we've been talking about heavy stuff, but it was really needed because there's so much confusion going around, and I'll bring up this subject again with other specialists in the matter on different traditions. But Luke, you are here, you are a druid, and I would love you to tell the audience about Druidry. So what is what does it mean to be a druid? And first, is it druidry or druidism? And just will you explain,
Okay.
please?
Well, both terms are acceptable. I think Druidism is the older term. Druidry is very much a kind of neo-pagan, neo-Druid term. And by that, I mean sort of the modern version. Okay, so I mean, the whole word Druid it's a modern English word anyway. So I mean, originally, people that were Druids would have been around sort of, I suppose, up to about 600 AD. There were Druids, really. Before that, 700 AD. Last them would have been in sort of probably in Ireland and Scotland. About that point, they had all become Christianized. And obviously, originally, it would have been, people would have used their own languages. They wouldn't have been speaking English. So those terms didn't exist. In Ireland, the term Drí is very close to that word. I don't really know what the exact term would have been in Gaul, because the Gaulish language has kind of died out a long time ago. That was extinct about 400 AD. So, you know, there's only fragments of that religion. So, you know, Druidism appears to have spread from Western Europe into sort of far reaches. So probably from the area of around the Danube area, people think possibly it might have been older, come from the steppes of Russia and spread throughout Europe and across to the margins. Of course, it only really survived in Western Europe on the edges, in Britain and in Ireland and in little bits of France, like Brittany, and in the Basque region of northern Spain. So you got little bits where it sort of survived, but it sort of basically really sort of died out and was rediscovered, sort of reimagined in 1700s onwards. So I mean, the original Druids would have been polytheists. They would believed in many different gods, and very much a nature religion. And of course, this got stamped out by Christianity. In mainland Europe, far more forcefully. In Ireland, in particular, it was sort of seemingly a peaceful conversion, which happened not instantaneously, but over a period of about 300 years. People say, I mean, it's coming up soon, St. Patrick's Day. You know, the story, as it's told, is that St. Patrick came and converted everyone to Christianity. And but actually, that's not actually how it happened at all. That's just the Christian kind of what you call hagiography. It's sort of a made-up story of, you know, the life of St. Patrick. Sort of would give him the credit for that. But I mean, you still had pagan burials in Ireland happening in the sort of late 600s. So that was like nearly 300 years later. So obviously they, you know, people didn't all convert in one go. It took quite a long time. But, you know, for the sake of, I don't know, what exactly the reasoning is, I suppose sort of church propaganda, it's easier just to say, oh, you know, the Druids are all gone, you know, a year after Patrick came and converted everyone, and it was all gone, all disappeared. But that's not the truth. It's a lot more complicated. So anyway, eventually they did die out, but a lot of the writing was preserved, despite, you know, various problems of books being destroyed, embargoes against the Irish language, etc. It did make a comeback. And a lot of the culture was transferred down generations orally. So you have a lot of folk traditions that have survived across Europe, which are connected with Druidism or Druidry. So really the modern movement is sort of a attempt to reconstruct a very old religion out of the, I suppose, the remains of, it's like digging up a dead body and you've got the bones left, but you don't know what the person looked like. So you have to kind of try to reconstruct that. You know how you get these forensic people, they make a clay model of what someone might have looked like. I suppose in a way, the kind of neo-Druidry is a bit like that, where you're trying to piece together the past to make a sort of a new model of what it would have looked like. But some of the practices that are attributed to Druids would be left out because they wouldn't be considered appropriate for modern times. For instance, the ancient Irish actually had slavery, and so that's not really very acceptable anymore, is it? So
nope.
and rightly so. You had a very hierarchical structure, so the Druids would be at a similar level to monarchy, certainly the most important ones. So now, such a rigid kind of class system that existed in ancient Ireland and Britain, that wouldn't be acceptable either. And human sacrifice, which is known to have happened in sort of the early period of Druidism, that wouldn't be acceptable anymore either. So obviously certain elements of it, and when I say that about human sacrifice, you have to remember that sort of in the sort of the pre-Christian era, this was quite common practice. The Romans did it, and I think the Vikings did it. Even much later, the Aztecs were doing that.
It's even mentioned in the Ancient Testament with
Yeah, and even in the Bible, you've got Abraham was going to sacrifice his son, and he was stopped. It was sort of more of a test than anything, I guess. But in the ancient world, that was, it wasn't so much a thing of evil. It was actually considered as perhaps a necessary act of contrition, of sacrifice, and offering to save your community, your society from disaster. People did actually believe that, like, if there'd been a famine, that if you sacrificed an animal, or in an extreme case a human being, that it would placate God or the gods and save you from further disaster. It's totally not acceptable anymore, but when you look at it in context, you realize it wasn't anything based on sort of a horrible desire to kill people. It was considered a sacred act that was necessary in order to preserve the society. That's why they did it, not because they're sadists.
Yeah.
And that's not acceptable, of course. So all this kind of stuff has been left out in the modern version because, well, it just wouldn't make any sense. People hopefully have matured a bit in terms of the conceptualization of the world and morality and the bigger picture. People used to believe the earth was flat. We now know it's not. And in spiritual terms, people have moved forward too.
Yeah. Obviously it was a cultural thing, such as human sacrifice, for instance. It was a sort of ignorance at the time, but their way of thinking, how their society was constructed, I suppose. Now about the Druids, because it may intrigue many people, like they may wonder, what does a Druid believe in, and what is the difference also between Druidry and, for instance, witchcraft? What is the particularity of the beliefs of a Druid?
Okay, well, it's really difficult to boil this down into a brief answer for both those questions, but I'll do my best to give you a brief answer. Okay, well, in basic terms, the modern Druid would believe very much in nature as sacred, the natural world as being sort of an emanation of the divine, of the gods or God. The very much animism, which is the belief that God lives in everything, would be very much part of modern Druid belief. So, something as simple as a cockroach, a flower, a bird, a river, a human being, all possess something of God, something that's holy, that the whole creation is sacred. That would be very much animistic belief, and that's very kind of central to most people's concept of being a Druid. So, someone that doesn't care about nature is not going to become a Druid. Other aspects would be, I suppose, things like healing, herbalism. There'd be big elements of it. Creative arts as well, music, poetry, writing, all the arts really, and sort of concepts such as truth, justice, honorable behavior. They'd be very key. So, you could go on for hours about what it all consists of, but I suppose that's sort of in a nutshell really what the core aspects of Druidry are. Of course, there's also magic involved as well, which it has in common with, as you mentioned, witchcraft. Now, the approach in Druidry it is quite different from what you'd find. I mean, I can't speak about traditional witchcraft or anything like that. I don't really know anything about it. I do know a bit about sort of the sort of Hermetic tradition, which goes back to sort of Greek and Egyptian kind of magic, and I know a little bit about Wicca, but I mean I haven't really studied either of those in great depth. But from my knowledge and experience, my own experience, I'd say that the Druid path is very much focused on the things I already mentioned, and the actual magical side is sort of like a bonus, if you want. It's sort of something that comes with the development of all these other aspects. That it's an inherently magical path, and that as you imbue yourself with all these creative arts and knowledge of herbalism and wisdom and justice, that you develop these magical faculties as you go. Whereas other kind of paths are maybe focused specifically on magic, on learning spells, on learning how to do certain rituals, and not on the development of the whole as an individual. Maybe some people disagree with me on that, but that's my perception. And that, I think personally that is the great strength of Druidism, is that it's very much about developing your psyche, yourself, your ethical stance, your values as a human being, how you sit in the world, how you behave as a human being, and not particularly about, I'm going to learn how to do spells or, that kind of thing. I mean, it's something that's that you learn how to do that as part of your path, part of your religious belief, rather than specifically learning that. I mean, you can become a magician without having any spirituality. You can just learn how to do magic without having any kind of spiritual identity. Whereas if you're a Druid, that is very much part of your spiritual identity, and learning how to do magic is secondary to that, I'd say.
Yeah, it's do no harm, and Druidry or Druidism is a way of life more, as well as a spirituality. What so tell us about the 8 festivals that the Druid honor to be in tune with the earth and the universe, please.
Okay, well, in the modern Druid tradition, it's kind of taken from what is believed to be the ancient tradition, which is 8 festivals. So you divide the year up, and I suppose one of the most ancient symbols is the equal-armed cross, sometimes with a circle around it as well. And this represents 4 points of the year, which were known to be celebrated in ancient form of Druidism and much earlier still, all across the world. In the earliest religions, you've got the solstices and the equinoxes. We're coming up to an equinox now, which is called the vernal equinox, the spring equinox, which is going to be the 20th March. Now, this is an astronomical event which happens every year at this fixed time. And you have another one on the opposite side of the year, the autumn equinox. And these 2 equinoxes are points where night and day are roughly equal. I suppose the exact point of equality is called the equinox, where the day is divided exactly in half. The astronomical event is very slightly different. So that's been celebrated for, you've got evidence of this going back, 7,000-8,000 years in the past, before Druidry existed. So it's actually found all over the world. And then you've got the solstices as well, which is midsummer, midwinter. Sorry.
We have a question about Newgrange and related to Druidry, so I think you can explain related to the solstices.
Oh, yes, absolutely, yes. Now, Newgrange is particularly, well, it's actually, that's not a great name for it, really. Newgrange is the modern word, sort of non-religious name. Brunaboyne or Slian Broga would be the older Irish names. And it actually was associated with a set of gods called the Tuatha Dé Danann, particularly with the god the Dagda, and with sorry, with his son Angus MacAnog, and also with Boan, because it's on the goddess. It's on the banks of the River Boyne, which comes from that goddess. So anyway, it is pre-Druidic, really. It's very old. I think it's, what is it, about 3,500 BC, I think they estimate it's built. Yes. So that's about 4,500 years ago. So these people probably wouldn't be called Druids back then, but later on, it would still be important to the Druids and probably still used by them. Although, of course, we no actual evidence to prove that. Without a time machine, you can't actually definitely prove that the Druids did use Newgrange. But, the tradition in Ireland is that it was of significance to the Druids and sort of all of the pre-Christian paganism in this country. So, I mean, it's to this day probably the most famous ancient religious site in Ireland. And probably, yeah. So this is actually related to, back to your question, the winter solstice, because that's when the chamber inside is lit up. Now, there would have been at one point a transparent, or not translucent, crystal, or rather 2 crystals that were across this, what they call the pillar box, which is where, like this sort of shape where the light would come in and penetrate. at the winter solstice. So, I mean, now for 3 days now, around the winter solstice, the light is going in and hitting the back wall of the main chamber. There's a big long tunnel that goes into the tumulus, and then you've got a sort of cross-shaped chamber with these sort of huge sort of bowls. And I mean, there's lots of theories about how people celebrated. What we do know is that it was used at that time, and they had cremated bones in there. It may have been used to store the bones and cremated remains of ancestors. It may have been used for ceremony. There's a lot of people have theories about the use of sound within Newgrange and other kind of temples of this time. So, I mean, a lot of it is speculation. We haven't been able to decode the pictographs within Newgrange or other places around Ireland from the Neolithic period. I mean, there's lots of people got theories about what these symbols meant, but, you know, they're just theories, really. There isn't any real proof. You know, it's not like the case with hieroglyphs. And, you know, the Rosetta Stone proved beyond a doubt what hieroglyphs meant because, you know, it had Latin and, oh no, was it Aramaic and Greek, I think, it had written alongside. So, you know, they could translate it exactly. There is nothing to compare the pictograms to of that time period. There's no sort of written language. So we can only really guess at what these things meant. But we do know for a fact that Newgrange was primarily associated with the winter solstice. Anyway, I kind of digressed from the question.
Yes, we're talking about the festival. It's so rich. Go on, please.
I've mentioned 4 things. So far, you've got the winter solstice, you've got the summer solstice, you've got the spring equinox, and you've got the autumn equinox. And this forms this 4 points on this equal arm cross. So that's a really ancient symbol, which is not just Druidic. You'll find it all over the world, and you'll find it on ancient stone monuments. So long before Christianity, that was a very powerful religious symbol. Now, in addition to that, you've got other festivals in Ireland, particularly, which is where they all come from. You've got what they call the Celtic fire festivals. And the first of those, which comes between the winter solstice and the spring equinox, would be called Imbolc, or Imolc, which is the festival of Brigid, who's one of the goddesses of the Irish Celtic pantheon. And that's sort of very much about the beginning of spring, the first signs of spring and the ending of winter. And that's particular to Ireland, but it's also spread across into Britain. In Scotland, particularly, it was very important, and you'd find it across parts of Europe. So I kind of often wonder if this was something that was maybe not particularly just important in Ireland and in Druidism. It may have been sort of common to a lot of sort of earlier religions, some of which don't exist anymore. So, sorry, did you want to show something?
Keep on talking. I'm showing a page of your book where people can.
Okay. The next one would be what's called Bealtaine, which is actually the Irish name for the May, and that's the beginning of May, and that's the beginning of summer, really, and sort of I suppose the official sort of end of sort of the darkness, the dark times, and abundance and summer and growth. I mean, and that would be historically a popular time for such things as marriages and for doing blessings of things like cattle. with these twin fires, driving your cattle and other livestock between them as a purification, and you put them up into the higher ground that the good weathers come. And then the third one is called Lunasa, named after the god Lu, although actually it's supposed to have been in honor of his foster mother, Teltu. Anyway, that is sort of in August, and that's very much associated with the harvest, and it's a time of horse racing and festivals and, you know, lots of jollity. In fact, even now that you do in Dingle, where I'm living, they do have, just after this Lunasa time, annual horse racing. They only have it for this few days, once a year, but it's that time. It's probably some people like, maybe romantically, thinking it's a sort of hangover from this ancient festival. So, and then finally, probably the most well-known of these is called Samhain, which is in modern parlance known as Halloween. This is around sort of the very end of October, and actually the month of November is called Samhain in Irish to this day. So I mean, that's a sort of very much a festival of the dead, a festival marking the passing into winter, into the darkness. And you know, these 4 Celtic fire festivals are kind of, they have a date, but they're much more of a movable feast. They're not astronomical events in the same way. You know, the equinoxes and solstices are fixed, not by us, but by the sun rotating and the earth going around it. That's how those are fixed. So we have no control over them. They are astronomical events set by the motion of the planet around our star, the sun. Whereas these other 4 festivals are more subjective, and some people celebrate them at specific dates, and others more on such things as, you know, when the hawthorn blossoms come out in May would be when some people celebrate Bealtaine. You know, there is a sort of astronomical link as well, but you know, these dates have kind of moved around a bit. Like Halloween is the 31st of October, but it's been celebrated at various points later than that into November, depending on what you believe, or, you know, what your tradition is. So all of these festivals are associated with nature, and also very much with agriculture. And, you know, I mean, people survived thanks to agriculture and you know, growing food, keeping livestock. You know, I mean, once we moved beyond hunter-gatherers, you know, we really did rely on harvests, on what we could grow and what animals we had. And, you know, for instance, the Samhain festival, that time would be traditionally when people slaughtered animals, because, you know, if you know you had like a rather sickly kind of cow that probably might not make it through the winter, it would make more sense to have it slaughtered and sort of, you know, smoke the meat or whatever, you know. What depends on where you live, but people have different ways of preserving food. But you know, and if you didn't preserve your food, if you didn't store it properly so it wouldn't go off, you know, if you had a very harsh winter, you could starve. So in reality, we still rely on agriculture. It's just that most people go to the supermarket to buy stuff. You know, if I planted a load of vegetables and they all died, you know, I at least have the backup that I could go to the supermarket and buy stuff. You know, back in the day, there was no shop. So, I mean, if you didn't succeed in growing food and keeping animals properly and, you know, having milk and eggs and blah, blah, you could starve. So people actually took this really seriously. These festivals is really vitally important to honor the gods and, you know, to mark what they call these sacred times, because you know, the agricultural cycle was so vital to actually staying alive. So now it's a lot more symbolic, you know, than it would have been previously. So, but I mean, you know, in reality, we still 100% rely on nature. You know, without the farmers that grow food, and without, you know, the animals that are providing, you know, various forms of food, you know, we wouldn't have anything to eat. And I mean, unfortunately, it's got very detached, you know, this horrible factory farming, and, you know, people have lost a sort of sense of sacred. People, even not that long ago, would have had a sort of backyard abattoir where they would have slaughtered their own animals. They would have maybe raised a pig or a cow themselves and then slaughtered it themselves. And they would have used all of it. They would have used everything, down to the hooves, the leather, the bones, and nothing would have been chucked out, you know. And nowadays people are just so, we've kind of got really blasé, because I mean, a lot of people don't even realize where their food comes from.
Yeah, we're disconnected from the earth and nature.
Mm.
And Druidry reconnects us as human beings to this planet and the cycles of nature. That is why Druids are celebrating these festivals, to keep in tune to the cycles of the seasons and the cosmos with the equinoxes and solstices, and the earth with the spring, autumn, summer, winter festivals. That's why you have this festival, to remind humans to be interconnected with the reality, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of interesting to note that, you know, Druidism's got really more popular as the whole kind of conservation movement took off. I mean, I suppose the beginnings of that, I would say, like, there's a book called Silent Spring, which came out in the 60s. And that kind of really kind of brought a lot conservation and ecology to a lot of people's attention. And, you know, from that time in the 60s, you've got this kind of sudden interest that kind of really began to pick up in sort of alternative religions, including Druidism or Druidry. And that's just got more and more accelerated as time has come on. And like, perhaps that's kind of reflects the fact that we've actually begun to realize that, you know, the world isn't infinite, that you can't just keep trashing everything endlessly and expect to get away with it. That you can't chop down every tree. You can't chop down the whole rainforest and expect still to have a decent life, you know. And you can't keep polluting the oceans and, you know, just turning places to deserts. You know, we are eventually going to run out of room. And if we keep on sort of living this kind of ultra consumerist lifestyle, we're going to pay the price. We will pay the price for it. And you could say, you know, people connect it with climate change, but actually I think it's got a lot more to do with lifestyles and about greed and consumerism and this expectation that, you know, can we have like 10 billion people in, you know, a few decades that all want like a, you know, a giant television and a car, and they want everything, and to live in luxury. We can't all live like kings. I'm not saying we should live in huts or anything, but, you know, we have to realize that we can't expect to have the life of luxury at no cost. And that if we're going to be selfish and we're not going to look after the planet or other species or even each other, then it will ultimately end in a disaster. So, you know, I mean, the writing's on the wall, really. I mean, there's been ecological disasters in the past on a smaller scale. You know, you could look at ancient Sumeria, which became unlivable. That was once really green and lush and full of trees and full of plants, and they irrigated it all. and then it became eventually untenable. And that was a lot to do with human behavior, partly to do with climatic changes, but more than anything, it was due to human practices, and including constant wars. So that became abandoned, and that whole civilization was rediscovered in, I think, the late 1700s, maybe. But it was pretty much forgotten about, and that can repeat itself on a larger scale. So I mean, if we're not mindful about looking after the planet, you could have a worldwide civilization collapse, and that can be avoided. We don't have to go down that road.
No, we don't. So no, we won't. We are approaching an hour and a half, and I would like to, before we reach nearly the end of this fascinating conversation, explanations, I would like to tell everyone who wants to know more about Druidism that Luke wrote a very, very handy book. It's the Druid's Primer. I just dropped the link here, and it is as well in the description of the video. Everything you want to know about Druidism, it's very simply explained, but there is everything. You have the 8 festivals, the history of Druidry or Druidism, and the Om alphabet, the alphabet of the trees. Some of you may have heard about it spelled Ogam, but it's said Om. Plenty of amazing description of all the traditions. So I recommend this book. It's very handy to know everything about Druidry. Look, if people are interested to learn how to become a Druid, what would you recommend? Or maybe we can drop some links after.
Okay, well, I would say probably the first thing to do is perhaps to try to read a bit about it. There's lots of interesting books on the subject. Obviously, I wrote that book to try and condense a lot of things into one volume, but there are some really good books on, for instance, the mythology. I'd recommend reading a lot of Irish, Welsh, Scottish mythology if you're interested in what you'll learn a lot about the Druids from that. There's also some sort of one particular book I read a long time ago in the late, about 1996. I got this book called The Book of Druidry by Ross Nichols, and I found it quite difficult to read, but actually there's an awful lot in that that's it's very, very informative. So that's definitely one to look out for. And I would say, if you find that you're drawn to it, there's different organizations around the world. The one I belong to is called OBOD, the Order of Bards, Ovids and Druids. I'm also a member of a more local one in Ireland called the Druid Clan of Darna. But, OBOD is all over the world. There's different groups as well, in particular in Britain, like the BDO, and in America, there's quite a few different Druid organizations as well. So, I mean, now with the internet, it's brilliant. You can actually find a lot of the stuff easily. When I first got interested, the internet didn't really exist. It was still kind of in its infancy, and you couldn't find anything. I had great difficulty finding anything other than a sort of a history book on the Druids. I couldn't find any Druid people to meet up with. And then I suddenly saw that book I mentioned, the Book of Druidry, in the shop window in London, in a bookshop. And I was like, oh my God, that looks interesting. I rushed in and I bought it. And that's the first time I actually seen an actual practical book that explained anything about being a Druid, Now it's all online, a lot of this information, and different groups to join, joining a grove, joining an order. It's actually quite easy to do now. So, I'd look into that. I mean, and, if it suits you, you just kind of keep going with it. Do some training. You do various courses, join a grove, and get to meet people. So yeah, I suppose in the modern age with the internet, it's now actually not that difficult to find your way if you want to go down this path.
Thank you very much. Before we close this this very, very interesting video, what would be, as a druid mainly, but first probably as a human being, your message, the message you would want to pass to humanity to help guide people in these strange times of change?
Yeah, strange times indeed. Well, I look at the way the world is going, and I see there's a lot of people who become very narcissistic. There's a lot of people who become quite frightened as well. And, it's become quite fashionable to be really selfish and to become self-obsessed. So I would say, if you want to do something good, you'd probably want to do the opposite. You'll probably want to try to be more selfless, to think about other people, to try and think of something good you can do for the world, for other people, for your community. And I think, well, what's the point of being here if all you're going to do is just suit yourself? Life has no meaning if you're just utterly selfish. So I think if you do good things in your life, that's its own reward in itself. That a lot of this sort of narcissistic world is so selfish and self-indulgent, but it's really short-lived buzz. You go out and you buy some expensive trinket, and you say, "Oh wow, look at this! I've got this lovely piece of jewelry. It cost $10,000 or something." But I mean, there's a very vicarious thrill. A week later, you're kind of like, what can I do now that will make me feel happy? Actually, doing good things, doing something nice, being thoughtful, being kind, trying to make the world a better place. Sometimes you have to be, a bit of tough love as well, but, doing actions in your life to make the world a better place, I think actually is, it gives meaning to your life. It makes you feel happier, and you feel like you're doing something positive. So, people are caught up in fear. Don't be fearful. Try to do something positive that will make a difference. And I think, if you can actually follow through on that on a regular basis, your life will just be happier. You won't be fearful. And, actually doing good things, you kind of forget about things that you thought you needed that actually don't matter at all. So that's what I would recommend, for, actually getting through these times.
Thank you very much, Luke Eastwood. I recommend your very, very useful and informative book, The Druid's Primer. You have the link just here and in the description. And thank you very much for your insights, knowledge, clarification. And next year, not next year, next week, next Friday, I will give the voice for an Irish shaman, traditional Irish shaman, Mrs. Amantha Murphy. So keep tuned. Next Friday, she will tell you amazing things. She is absolutely a magical woman, and myself, I'm looking forward to interview her. So next Friday. Thank you, Luke Eastwood. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been really interesting, and it's been nice to answer some questions that other people haven't asked me, which going down some different rabbit holes, if you like, which it's interesting for me to talk about these things, because a lot of these things are rarely brought up. So thank you very much. That was that was very interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Luke. Thank you. Bye.
Bye bye.